This is kind of the scenario that everyone was hoping we could avoid. No clear-cut winner at this point. Very close races in some key states, and it's going to take a while to kind of figure out what happened and what sorts through. What happens in the meantime?
Sure. I mean, and I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is that the American public did great. Notwithstanding this entire election season, we were seeing and hearing attacks on the legitimacy of our election. We were seeing lots of efforts to try and deter people from the polls, but Americans really showed up. And now is the process whereby the counting needs to happen. Many states have different rules for how they process mail ballots that are coming in, how they do canvassing, how they do audits, how they do recounts. And then there's going to be some litigation, which I think is going to be a last battle in a number of these different states.
I mean, I think it's probably worth pointing out that this is a very decentralized system. Each of the states gets to set its own rules for how this happens. We've seen a lot of kind of legal challenges to how some of those rules were set. And I think that becomes the big question. How does this work its way through the court system at this point?
Sure. So as you mentioned, each state has different rules. Different states have different rules for when they count mail ballots. And so that means some states are still processing the mail ballots that are coming in because the ballots are legally and lawfully still arriving. And then we also are seeing states have different ways in which they tally the votes. And so the way it usually works is that there's a process for getting the mail ballots, making sure that those are counted, looking at the in-person votes, making sure that those look similar to what the records that we have indicate that people are happening. Then they canvass all of those. They give voters an opportunity to correct some technical defects and do those things. And then they put them all together and come up with statewide totals. And then if there's any close elections, there'll be recounts. So I think there are a lot of checks in the system to try and make sure that we get the count accurate. And I think one thing that's going to be new for Americans is to see that play out in real time, because I think in the past we have not had this many mail ballots coming in, so they were easier to process. And in the past, we haven't had all the checks and measures in as many states as we do to make sure that every vote is counted fairly and accurately. I think most Americans would agree that an accurate count, one that is reflective of voting rights, is more important than speed. But at a time like now, when people have a very big question they want answered, I think that's a little bit hard for people to keep at the front of mind.
Right. You can imagine the pressure being put on these election officials state by state where the counts are still going on, and hearing about some of them just finally sending people home to take a little bit of a rest because they'd been working 13 hours or longer while they were counting through some of these things.
Sure.
I think patience is probably in order on this. If you were looking for where you might see challenges, though, obviously we're looking at Wisconsin now, where the vote count there is less than 10,000 between the two candidates. You're looking at Pennsylvania, where it could take them several days to count up. Same thing with Michigan. Is that where you would be focusing at this point? You've also got Nevada, where the count takes a little bit longer coming in from Maricopa County and some other places.
Yeah, I think those are
there lawyers kind of fanning out to all these places?
Right. I mean, I think that there's already some lawsuits that we're seeing. I mean, yesterday I saw 3 lawsuits being filed in Pennsylvania alone. These litigation has been playing a really heavy role in this election, and it went through different phases. In the first part of the pandemic season, we saw a lot of litigation over who would have access to mail ballots and what we were going to do to accommodate the fact that we're voting in a once-in-a-century global pandemic. And then we saw a wave of pushbacks on the reforms to try and expand that access. And now we're seeing like a very, what I would call like brass knuckle fight over individual ballots and whether like particular segments of ballots are going to get counted. We saw this in Harris County when there was an attempt to try and stop the counting of the ballots that were being used for drive-through locations.
Drive-up, yeah. Right.
Yeah, we're seeing this in Pennsylvania where folks are trying to get certain ballots not counted because the election administrator are contacting voters and giving them an opportunity to correct any mistakes. We're going to see a lot of litigation. And my bet is that in the end, the voters are not going to receive these particular attacks on their ballots very well. I think it's one thing for people to be fighting over the rules of the game, but I think once a voter has actually cast their ballot, they expect it to count. And I think ultimately it's going to be a losing proposition for politicians to try and be shaving particular segments of the population, and they don't actually know whose voters are going to be impacted when they do that. But right now, it complicates everything, and it creates a very big issue when we're talking about the legitimacy of the court. Because people,
it does, but I will say the judges' rulings, for the most part that I've seen, seem to have been pretty nonpartisan, sticking by the rules in going through some of these situations. I mean, well, we do have the courts there for this reason.
Right. I do think that, I think depending on your vantage point and what you imagine the jurisprudence to be, I think you could have different opinions on how these decisions are shaking out. Certainly, there have been some doctrinal issues that I think are a little bit hard to square with some of the other doctrinal issues that have been coming from the court. But what I think is really important to remember is that we are at a particular moment in our country's history where we are facing a reckoning for all sorts of things, as how we've been inclusive as a system, what are we doing about racial justice? And I think people are used to the courts coming in and protecting our right to vote. And I think if we continue to see the campaigns and the politicians running into court to try and shave off certain voters from participating, there's going to be a real question as to whether or not, among the public at least, about whether or not we can depend upon the courts to do that. So I think there's a lot of entangled about our system. It's not just what we're seeing on election day. It's what are our institutions going to be like.
Shepard Smith here. Thanks for watching CNBC on YouTube.